Hello and welcome to another episode of Saga Stories from the Reykjavik Grapevine. My name's Matthew Roby and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Iceland. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today. This is the second video in our series on the majestic Snæfellsnes Peninsula. And throughout our stay here, we've been sleeping at the beautiful Hotel Búðir, which is right here behind me. And today we're going to be telling stories from Eyrbyggja saga, which was the very first saga I ever read and is still one of my personal favourites. The saga was probably composed in the mid-13th century, and it's one of the few sagas that is actually attested in surviving manuscripts from that time. Now, the name of the saga, Eyrbyggja saga, literally just means the saga of the people of Eyri, which just refers to one place in the far northwest of the peninsula. But the saga could just as well be called Snæfellsnesinga saga, because it tells stories about the families and people living all throughout the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, from around the time of settlement to around the time just after Christianization. And in fact, that's quite an important point about the saga. Unlike some other famous sagas like Egil saga and Grettis saga, Eyrbyggja saga doesn't have just one plot or one main hero. Rather, it would probably be better to describe it as an episodic saga, because it's comprised of a series of loosely connected stories which roughly centre around the figure of the wise chieftain Snorri Goði, but some of the stories don't actually involve him at all. And so we're going to be talking about two stories today, and I've chosen these two because they pertain to one of my research interests, and that is the use of supernatural phenomena to symbolise and explore sexual themes. And both of today's stories explore the theme of elderly female sexuality, and also the theme of large age gaps between old women and the youthful objects of their affection or lust. So again, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll enjoy it. For our first story from Eyrbyggja saga, we've come to a spot on the northern shore of Snæfellsnes, on the spot between the locations of two medieval farmsteads. One of them is Holt, which would have been somewhere within view here to the west, and Mávahlíð, which would have been somewhere within view here to the east. And according to the saga, in these two farmsteads live two women. Katla lives at Holt over there, and Geirríðr lives at Mávahlíð over here. Now, both of these women are at least middle-aged, old enough to have adult children of their own, but neither of them has a husband at the time. And both of them are skilled in magic. And the story that we're going to tell is about a young boy named Gunnlaugur, who was probably a teenager at the time, who lived at Fróðá, which is just about 5 kilometers further down the coast to the west. Now, Gunnlaugur is interested in magic, and he receives magic lessons from Geirríðr, who lives at Mávahlíð. But unfortunately, Katla, the other woman who lives at Holt, develops a romantic interest in Gunnlaugur, and she seems to be jealous of the amount of time that Gunnlaugur is spending with Geirríðr. Now, you can see that there's sort of a claustrophobic sense to this rivalry because the two farmsteads are within sight of one another. So Katla would be able to see Gunnlaugur walking past her house to get to Mávahlíð, and then she would be able to monitor just how long he stays at Mávahlíð, and then he has to walk past her house on the way back. So perhaps all the while she's watching him coming and going and seething with jealousy. When Gunnlaugur leaves Mávahlíð, apparently he has to, like I said, he has to walk past Holt, and Katla always offers that he should stay there with her for the night, but he always refuses. Now, one day, when Gunnlaugur is on his way to Mávahlíð, Katla makes her feelings more clear. She famously asks him whether he's on his way to Mávahlíð to stroke the old woman's groin again. Now, Gunnlaugur says no, and he scolds Katla for this, because he says you shouldn't be mocking Geirríðr for being old, because you two are of a similar age. Katla scoffs and simply replies that although Gunnlaugur seems to value Geirríðr very highly, he should realise that there are other women who might know a thing or two. And this conversation reveals Katla's sexual jealousy, with the last line having both the surface meaning that Geirríðr isn't the only woman who could teach Gunnlaugur magic, but it also has the underlying meaning that Gunnlaugur shouldn't overlook what Katla has to offer him sexually or romantically. In any case, Gunnlaugur continues his lessons with Geirríðr and continues to refuse Katla's offers of hospitality every night, until finally, one day, when Gunnlaugur is about to leave Mávahlíð, his teacher Geirríðr warns him that he should stay there with her that night because she predicts that some disaster is about to befall him. He refuses, leaves the house, walks past Holt as he always does, and Katla once again offers for him to stay there with her, and once again he refuses. But it turns out that Gunnlaugur doesn't get home that night. And in the morning, his father looks out at the farmstead at Fróðá to find Gunnlaugur bruised and unconscious in front of his door. Apparently he's all bruised and bloody around the shoulders, and apparently the flesh has been torn from his bones. And at this point, Katla's adult son Oddur says that Geirríðr must have ridden him, and accuses her of being this thing called a kveldríða, although it turns out after the situation unfolds that it was actually Katla who rode him. Now, what is a night rider? It seems to be related to the broader trope of the nightmare, which is a figure, often female, who attacks people at night, usually in their sleep. But the trope also has obvious sexual connotations, which are heightened in this episode by the sexual jealousy that has already been established of the predator over the victim. And there are other things that support a sexual reading of this attack, including the use of the word ríða to refer to sexual intercourse elsewhere in the corpus. And there is also a physical description of the attack of a kveldríða in another saga. That's a legendary saga called Eyrbyggja saga Gríðarfóstra, which shows how medieval audiences might have imagined the attack of one of these kveldríðr, where the woman leaps on top of the man from behind, encircles him with her legs, and then rides him around, possibly on all fours or possibly in some kind of piggyback. And this would make sense with the wounds that are described that Gunnlaugur has, because he's been bruised and bloody on his shoulders where he's been gripped by the female assailant. Now, all of this leads me to conclude that medieval audiences might have interpreted this attack as a symbolic sexual assault of the young boy by this older woman. But how is the assault framed? Well, the attack is portrayed to have negative consequences, since it severely wounds the young boy, and once her crimes are uncovered, it ultimately leads to Katla's execution over at the shore just north of here. So the aggressive sexuality of a woman, in this case an older widow against a much younger man, is implicitly characterised in a negative light. It's undesirable and injurious to the men to whom it is directed, and it is shameful for the woman herself. And so that's it for the story of the evening rider or kveldríða that attacks Gunnlaugur here between the farms of Mávahlíð and Holt. Our second story for today might be one of my favourite episodes in all of saga literature, and that's called the Fróðá, which literally translates as the wonders at Fróðá. And in order to tell that story, we've come here to the northern coast of Snæfellsnes, near to the location of the medieval farmstead of Fróðá. This episode takes place right after Christianization, so around the year 1000. And at the farmstead at Fróðá lives a farmer named Þóroddur, his wife, whose name is Þuríður, and their teenage son, whose name is Kjartan, although it becomes clear later in the saga that Kjartan isn't in fact Þóroddur's child, but rather Þuríður's son with a man with whom she has a prolonged affair. And the story starts like this. The summer after Christianization, a ship arrives on the northern coast of Snæfellsnes, just to the west of here, and apparently on the ship is a Hebridean woman whose name is Þórgunna. And word spreads around the peninsula that this woman, Þórgunna, has with her some very fine textiles and clothes. And Þuríður, that's the the mistress here at Fróðá is apparently something of a showy woman. She likes to dress up, and so she goes to the ship to see whether she can buy some of these wares. But when she gets to the ship, she asks Þórgunna and sees all of the beautiful clothing that she has, and asks her whether she could buy any. But Þórgunna insists, no, these are my clothes, and they're not for sale. But not one to be deterred, Geirríðr invites Þórgunna to come and stay with her at the farm at Fróðá, expecting that she'll be able to convince Þórgunna to sell her something in time. When Þórgunna arrives at the farm, which was somewhere around here, she's given a bed in the farmstead, and she opens her chest and takes out some beautiful sheets, apparently lovely bed sheets, bed curtains, and even a bed canopy. And apparently these bedclothes are so beautiful that no one at Fróðá has ever seen anything like it. And in fact, you can imagine in the context of the relative poverty of medieval Iceland, these beautiful sheets must have seemed almost supernaturally beautiful, as if Þórgunna was someone who had come out of one of the legendary sagas or one of the romances and been transported into an Icelandic family saga. When Geirríðr sees these bed sheets, she's even more determined to get them and asks Þórgunna again whether she can buy them. And Þórgunna says, no, these are for me. And she also refuses to pay either using the clothes or using any money for her stay at the farm. She says, I am very capable of working, and so I will pay for my keep by working here at the farm. Now the saga goes into a description of Þórgunna. People think she's probably in her mid-50s. She's a large and robust woman who goes to church every day. And she is a very hard worker. When it's a rainy day, she's working inside at weaving, but whenever it's fine weather outside, she's out here with the rest of the farm workers doing outdoor farm work. She's apparently quite a polite woman, but not very talkative, except when it comes to the farmer's teenage son, Kjartan. Apparently she loves him very much and wants to spend all of her time with him, but he doesn't return her affections, which apparently makes her quite irritable. So from this description we might be able to pick up on a few significant details. Þórgunna is an older woman, probably peri or postmenopausal in age, but she's very defensive of her adult capability. She demands to be treated as a valuable worker on the farm, and she also seems to want to defend her status as a romantically and sexually desirable woman, as demonstrated in her defensiveness over her fine bed sheets, which are sort of symbols of her sexual prowess, and also in her romantic interest in the teenage boy Kjartan. But the fact that Kjartan snubs her advances might indicate that the saga is suggesting that Þórgunna is trying to cling on to this adult capacity long after it has become inappropriate or undesirable, and this detail is pertinent to the ensuing wonders. And the first wonder that happens while Þórgunna is working somewhere in the fields here outside on an autumn day. She's tossing hay, along with many of the other farm workers, to dry it for winter fodder. And while they're doing this, the workers apparently see a single black cloud in the sky somewhere to the northwest. And the cloud seems to have a sort of a supernatural agency. It apparently rushes with great speed right over our heads here, only over Fróðá. And the workers can see that this is probably going to bring rain, so the farmer, Þóroddur, immediately instructs all of his farm workers to rake their hay into little piles to avoid it getting too wet. But Þórgunna doesn't listen. She doesn't listen to this instruction to stop working, and she keeps tossing her hay, apparently almost in a mad frenzy. And then the cloud opens and the rain starts to come. There's a torrential downpour, and apparently the sky turns so dark that people can barely see their hands in front of their faces. But the cloud disappears just as quickly as it has come, and once it disappears it becomes clear to everyone that in fact the cloud hadn't rained water, it had rained blood. Now the weather clears up nicely, and apparently most of the hay dries very quickly, but not the hay around Þórgunna, nor does the blood dry on Þórgunna herself or on the rake that she has been using. Now, in my own work, I argue that this blood rain is something of a menstrual metaphor which pertains to Þórgunna's menopause and old age. The end of her life as a farm worker and as a sexual entity has come. And Þórgunna's frenzied hay raking is sort of a symbol of her attempts to resist this transition. But once the blood rain has come, she seems to surrender, and she returns to the farmstead and goes to her bed, and apparently she turns very ill. And she calls the farmer over and she makes a series of prophecies to him. The first is that she wants to be buried at Holt because she foresees that it will have some Christian importance later in the Middle Ages. And that's true. Around the year 1000, of course, there is no bishopric in Iceland, but Þórgunna seems to be able to predict that Holt will become one of Iceland's 2 bishoprics, which some of you might know it later does. And her second prophecy is that Þórgunna has to burn her bedclothes and burn all of her fine clothing, and especially make sure that they're not given to Geirríðr. And if he doesn't do that, she predicts that some terrible things might happen. Now, shortly after making these prophecies, Þórgunna does die, and Þóroddur, following her instructions, takes all of her belongings, the bedclothes and all the fine cloths, out to a pyre and prepares to burn them. But before he can manage to do that, his wife Geirríðr arrives, and unfortunately she's able to convince him not to burn all of her belongings. So finally she gets hold of those bedclothes that she'd coveted so much. Now obviously Þóroddur isn't happy about that, but there you go. Now, the journey to transport Þórgunna's body to Holt is about 250 kilometres, and so it probably would have taken more than a week each way. And it's on this journey that the next of the Fróðárundur, or the next of the wonders at Fróðá, happens. When they're halfway to Holt, they stop at a farm called Nes it Niðra. But when they get there, the farmer there refuses them hospitality, even though it is apparently against the law in medieval Iceland not to assist people on funeral journeys. But unable to go anywhere else, because this is the nearest farmstead, or this is the only farmstead for quite some way around, Þóroddur and the other pallbearers decide that they will have to stay at this farmstead. And so they go into the farmhouse, but they're not receiving hospitality. They know they're not going to get fresh clothes and they're not going to get fed. Now, when everyone is asleep that night, the householders hear some kind of racket in the kitchen, and they come down to see what all of the commotion is, and there they see a large naked woman preparing a meal. They don't know really what's going on, but then Þóroddur and the other pallbearers arrive on the scene, and they confirm that this large woman is the bloated, partially decaying, reanimated corpse of Þórgunna, preparing a meal for them. So she makes the meal and sets it down on the table. Now obviously this is quite a terrifying spectacle, a revenant making a meal in your farmhouse, and so the stingy farmer immediately regrets refusing them hospitality and decides he will let them stay. They have a fire lit, they give them some fresh clothes, and then they sit down to eat the meal that Þórgunna has prepared, although they do take some precautions before they eat it, since it's been prepared by a zombie, by blessing it with prayers and holy water. Now news of this marvel spreads before them, and so apparently they get great hospitality for the rest of their journey, both to and from Holt. But then when they get back here to Fróðá, unfortunately more eerie marvels start to happen. So the night that they get back from the journey, a moon apparition appears on the wall in the farmstead, and somebody says that it is a prophecy of death. And sure enough, a little while later, one of the shepherds who works here at Fróðá comes home and is very sullen and downcast. He doesn't say very much to anyone and goes to bed, and shortly afterwards he dies. And they bury him here at the church at Fróðá. But unfortunately, this shepherd does not rest peacefully. One night when another man is going out to use the toilet, because in those days toilets were all outside, he sees the farmer between him and the door of the farmstead. He sees the shepherd the dead shepherd that they just buried, stopping him from getting back into the farm. The shepherd manages to grab him and fling him against the door. Luckily, the man does manage to escape the shepherd's clutches and get back inside the farm. But he seems to have been tainted with this sickness. He goes to his bed. Shortly afterwards, he dies, and he gets buried in the farm here too. And then apparently they're seen walking around together, this man and the shepherd, late at night. And so people start to feel like it's not safe to go outside at night with these ghosts walking around. And unfortunately, more and more people start to fall sick and die. They get buried here and they join this undead troop outside. Now, the way that this sickness of death and reanimation passes from person to person, sometimes after direct contact with one of the ghosts, seems to resemble a contagious disease. And so it might have been a symbol for the way diseases spread through communities. Now at this point, the farmer, Þórður, has to take some of his men in a rowing boat west of here along the coast of Snæfellsnes to pick up some more stores of dried fish. And while they're away on this journey, the rest of the people at Fróðá are sitting around the fire one night, and an unusual seal's head comes up out of the fireplace. And apparently this seal's head is staring angrily at the bedclothes of Þórgunna, which should have been burned. So possibly the seal is warning them to burn the bedclothes, or is angry that they haven't burned the bedclothes. A few people at the farm try to subdue this seal and knock it back into the fire, but it just rears up even more, until apparently the whole seal's body, even up to its flippers, are sticking up out of the fireplace. Now luckily, the young boy, the teenage Kjartan, is still at the farm, and he manages to subdue the seal. He takes a sledgehammer, knocks the seal on the head, and is able to push it back down into the fireplace. Now, the way that the seal is staring at the bedclothes might indicate not only that it's a warning that Þórgunna's bedclothes need to be burned, but it might connect this seal to Þórgunna herself. And this notion is solidified in the fact that the seal responds to the attacks of Kjartan, but not to anyone else. You might remember that Þórgunna loved Kjartan very much, and so she was willing to do what he wanted. But then it turns out, the day after this seal has appeared in the fireplace, the people at the farm find out that Þórður and his crew, who were off collecting dried fish, have actually been shipwrecked off the north coast of Snæfellsnes. The boat has washed up on the shore, but the bodies can't be found. And so people presume that they've drowned. And it's possible, although not explicit, that it was this same seal that rose up in the fireplace here that caused their deaths. Because in many sagas, supernatural people can take the form of sea mammals like seals, and they're also known to cause shipwrecks. Now, the people at Fróðá hold a funeral feast for Þórður and the rest of his drowned crew, and apparently the drowned crew even arrive for the first night of the funeral. And at first people think this is a good sign that the reanimated drowned crew have returned for the funeral. Apparently in pre-Christian lore, this meant that they had been accepted by the sea goddess Rán. But unfortunately, the drowned crew continue to return every single evening, and this continues even after the funeral is over. And what's worse, they're occupying the fireplace, which is sort of a main location in a medieval Icelandic farmstead. It's used for cooking food, it's also used for sitting around and socialising, and it's used for warming stones to keep people warm at night. And so the fact that the drowned crew are surrounding the fireplace, wringing out their wet clothes and splashing water everywhere, means that the living people at the farm can no longer use the fireplace, and they are relegated to a little fire in a side room. And to make matters worse, after a little while, the people who were buried and reanimated also start coming to the farmstead and hanging around near the fireplace. So you have the drowned crew coming in and making a big wet mess near the fireplace, and then you also have the buried people coming in and shaking their muddy clothes everywhere. And so obviously this is not a good time to be at Fróðá with these ghosts coming around every night. And then unfortunately, more people start to fall ill, and they expect that this plague of illness, death and haunting is going to keep continuing. And one of the people who falls ill this time is Geirríðr, the mistress at Fróðá. So Kjartan at this point decides that he's had enough of these marvels, and he goes to consult with Snorri Goði, who is a chieftain on Snæfellsnes and is known to be very wise. And Kjartan comes back with a plan from Snorri, which he enacts to get rid of the marvels. And it consists of 3 things. The first thing he does is burn Þórgunna's bedclothes, which obviously satisfies her instructions and might stop her wrath from being inflicted upon the farm. The second thing he does is quite interesting and very funny. He holds a court where he charges the ghosts for trespassing. And apparently the ghosts do arrive when they're summoned, and they listen to the cases and they listen to their sentences, and after they've been sentenced, they do leave. It's an interesting little episode, and it sort of shows just how significant legislative process and the law was in the medieval Icelandic imagination. And the third thing that he does is brings with him a few priests, and they bless the house with prayers and holy water and hymns. By using this 3-pronged approach, apparently Kjartan is able to end the wonders here at Fróðá. He takes command of the farm here, sets up his own home there, and apparently becomes an admired and well-respected figure until his death. And so that is the story, the very complicated story of the wonders at Fróðá. So that's it for another episode of Saga Stories from the Reykjavik Grapevine, here on the majestic peninsula of Snæfellsnes. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to like, subscribe and comment below. My name is Matthew Roby, postdoctoral fellow from the University of Iceland, and I'd like to thank you once again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.